Welcome. It's really great to see you all again. Welcome back. I'm really happy to see all of you, and I'm really excited about today's expert. It seems like every time I turn on the news today, there are conversations about policy. What policy will President-elect Biden introduce? What will he be able to accomplish? Where will he face a battle? I bet most of you are excited with me last week when the transition team announced that the Director of Science and Technology would be elevated to a cabinet level position. I think I think we are close to a turning point for the way that science is perceived in this country. At least I think we can be at a turning point. But to a very large extent, that's going to depend on us, on me, on all of you. We have a new president coming in and hope that STEM will have an elevated importance in our country. This is a critical moment for our country, for our future. I've been digging a lot into effective policy over the past year, and I'm incredibly excited to learn more from a friend to the STEM learning ecosystem's community of practice, James Brown. James is the executive director of the STEM Ed Policy Coalition. Prior to joining the coalition, he was director of advocacy at the American Chemical Society. A nuclear engineer by training, he previously worked as a legislative aide for Doc Hastings of Washington, was director of policy and development at the Consumer Energy Council of America, and began his career as an engineer with Newport News Shipbuilding, working on aircraft carrier construction. He received a BS from the University of New Mexico and an MS from Penn State, both in nuclear engineering, and he also holds an MBA from George Washington University. A lot of what we're going to do today, hopefully, is take your questions. So I want you to keep chatting, keep having conversations, keep sharing your thoughts in the chat, but you should also see down at the bottom of your screen a little Q&A button. Make sure you click on that button and add your questions. The earlier, the better. And even if you don't specifically have a question to ask or can't think of one, still open up that button and take a look at the questions that other people have been asking, because you can vote those up. And those, questions that have more votes are ones that we're more likely to be able to sneak in before the hour's up. So get those questions in there. But before we go to your questions, I know that I have a couple of James and James. We haven't really met in depth yet, but I think I was sharing with you that the whole reason that I do these things is because I have lots of questions and I want them to get asked. So this is my opportunity to do that. So welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jeremy. Happy to be here today, and thanks for the walk-on music. I'm surprised you didn't play "I Feel Good," which is, I think, how a lot of us are feeling about tomorrow.
It's I'm definitely excited. I'm definitely looking forward. So James, that actually kind of brings us to a really good starting point. What's our biggest hope for STEM in this new administration? What do you think that we can expect from the new administration?
Well, what's interesting to me is the first time a president of the United States used the term STEM education was in the 2006 State of the Union address that George W. Bush made back when he was president. And this will be the fourth administration in a row where I can expect STEM to be a theme. And I think, in these times, I think there's both a need and a big opportunity to deal with science, technology, engineering, and math education. And that's because there's so much focus on the education system, the recovery to learning challenges as a result of the pandemic, and the fact that we have really massive amounts of federal aid flowing to state governments and to school systems across the country, towards that objective of reopening schools and enacting an effective recovery to learning. The landscape is pretty rich with opportunities to do that. So it really leaves it to the Biden administration to be effective in taking advantage of that moment and of being a good listener to the community and reflecting the needs of our community and their policies.
It really is very exciting. I know that I probably to a level that was inappropriate. I was so excited about science being a cabinet level position. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity that might bring. So I'm hoping that you can maybe spend a little bit of time before we get to people's questions, kind of guiding us through a little bit how we can ensure that this happens, how we can ensure that science is a hallmark component of the policy agenda of this administration.
Well, so to your point about the science advisor, so the newly appointed science advisor is Eric Lander, who was associated with the Human Genome Project for a long time. He was actually the co-chair of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology under the Obama administration. So is a familiar person to the president himself, and that is an important part of that equation in terms of elevating science, is that a president, to elevate somebody to that kind of position, has to trust them, has to know them, has to be willing to follow their advice. So so the groundwork is certainly there for that. I think for our part, one of the things that our community needs to do is needs to be able to articulate the things we've experienced in our ecosystems, in our communities, in our schools in a way that is valuable and translatable to policymakers. I think we have to get well beyond, we just need to elevate education. We need to elevate the STEM subjects and be able to put our heads together, both collectively and individually, and think through what specific kinds of policies the federal government can enact, and who should be enacting them, to achieve some of the goals that I think we all share. And that's going to require us to go a little bit further than we have. I sort of trace the arc of STEM as a presidential priority. A big part of the beginning of this journey was getting it to be a presidential priority. And the Obama administration continued to elevate it. The Trump administration had a STEM agenda. They thought about it in new ways that we can learn from and benefit from the things that they did well and poorly. And I really think the Biden administration is really the first presidential administration where you have all the pieces in place to make a big difference in this particular space. And that puts us in a change from just trying to elevate the issue to really trying to be architects of our own future and describing accurately and with evidence the ways in which the federal government can aid on these issues.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute there for a second. So James, we always hear people talking about how critical the first 100 days are. First of all, why is that? Why are these why is that so important? How that sets the tone?
Well, the first president to coin the term was Franklin Roosevelt, and this was after the Great Depression. A new president with great majorities in both houses of Congress. He coined that term of, in our first 100 days, we're going to do things that will change the country, and that's where Social Security came from. It's from other fundamental. That term itself is associated with a president laying out their agenda while they've still got the most of their political capital, and they make choices about where to fight with Congress and where not to fight with Congress, and things to do that sort of shape their legacy. And if you look at the number one agenda of recent presidents, like one of the examples of this agenda being carried forth, was the No Child Left Behind law, right? Which, better or worse, that was HR1 under the George W. Bush administration. The Obama administration had the stimulus of 2009, which was a massive influx of money into the education system and begot Race to the Top, which I know people are familiar with. The Trump administration's first 100 days was heavily weighted towards tax policy and other things that were not education oriented. And so I think, the reason why it's important is these are the formative choices that new administrations make. And if they choose to go in the direction of education as a big policy agenda over the first 100 days, it really means that's what their administration is going to be about for the first 4 years. So, that's why it's consequential. And like I said, I think the landscape is really right for the administration to delve into education because, there's not a family in this country that hasn't been affected by the state of the school system over the course of the last year under the pandemic, right? So it's on everybody's minds. That's a prerequisite for taking action on this front. So I really feel like the dominoes are lined up. We just have to figure out how to push them over.
But I think that really leads us, I think, to another question that I'm sure everybody in the call has. I know you're familiar with the ecosystems, but the community of practice is this national initiative, but it's made up of these individual pockets of ecosystems around the country. So if that 100 days is so critical, what is it that we, as both a national initiative and these individual kind of state level and local initiatives, need to be doing to make sure that STEM and science become part of that 100 days and therefore a big push for the first 4 years?
Well, the Biden administration, the transition, the president-elect has laid out 4 priority areas that they're hoping to gain input and will make an early theme of the administration. Those are COVID and its responses, both immediate and longer term, the economic recovery that underlies the need to get America back to work, climate change, and equity. Those are the four fronts in which they've laid out, as the cornerstones of their agenda. And you can expect to see executive actions on day one that are going to address all of those different things. I think you'll see a path for reopening schools. I think you will see a number of economic measures like extending unemployment benefits, student loan payment forgiveness, or at least deferral of payments, some of the continuation of the policies that have aided the recovery. And then I think the opportunity, that's sort of what's already in the works. The administration's already said, that's what they're going to do on day one. Day one is tomorrow, right? But the next set of questions I really think that will come out of this 100 days agenda is that on April 20th, which is day 100, roughly speaking, I think they want to have a fully formed idea of what the longer term policies that need to be in place to regain the lost learning, right? If we go past, if 100 days we're down the road to reopening schools, that's really step one on the process of recovery, right? There are two big parts that we play into as a STEM education community. One of them is what can schools do differently to make up for the learning that's lost and to be better in general at preparing students for the challenges of the world they live in now, right? And not the one they were living in. And secondly, how does the workforce need change over the course of the next several years? What have we learned about the people that are out of work? What can our community do to get them back to work and to, and in more gainful employment down the road? I think those are the questions that, you're not going to solve those in 100 days, but you're going to architect a structure for solving those. That's going to be embedded in their budget priorities. That will be embedded in the large initiatives they envision around infrastructure and around successive aid packages for schools and state and local governments. All of that will come together in the next several months. And I think we have an avenue for making sure our voices are heard and those products and those plans are shaped according to our needs.
So, I was actually going to go in a slightly different direction, and you just mentioned funding and all of those and dollars. And we've got a really great question here from, I hope I don't say your name wrong, Odalis Pollard. Odalis, are you there with us?
Yes, I'm here.
How badly did I mess up your name?
Not too bad. It's pronounced Odalis.
Odalis, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, I got it now. So Odalis, could you ask your question?
Yeah, so we all know that quality STEM education requires money. If we're to be frank, we know that schools that have adequate funding can provide adequate resources to provide great STEM education. So how can we establish policies that can ensure that enough funding, proper funding can be provided to school regardless of where they are, the demographics? We know that, especially in New York City, we have zone schools, and we know that they don't have as much funding as other schools, such as specialized high schools, that, we know that there's a drastic difference in the type of education that they're receiving.
So I would answer that question on two fronts. So to get really simple, one of the things we can convey back to the administration is which existing funding streams from the federal government are ecosystems taking advantage of, our school systems in our country taking advantage of to make STEM a priority, and how can we amplify those, right? I mean, that's the first piece, is look at what's effective, let's look at what's being employed and see if we can get more of that, right? That's a question of priorities in terms of what already exists. But in my mind, the bigger opportunity is probably also thinking about the pathways where the federal government can try some new things that we think would be beneficial that haven't been done. And particularly in light of the last 4 years of administration budget priorities, where there was a lot of downward pressure on education budgets in general, and Congress kind of balanced that pressure with budgets that were largely flat. I think, the notion of doing some of the new things that have been contemplated over the years, that could be STEM master teachers. That could be, additional professional development assistance. That could be broadband deployment. It could be other things that are not really part of the existing mix of federal supports for schools that we think are really smart to do it that way. The other thing I think is an idea for us to think about as a community is, can we gain some advantage for communities that really do make STEM education a priority, in the same way that the opportunity zones and promised neighborhoods and other community-based supports have provided a means for wrapping around community-based supports from federal funding to aid education. That is an example of things that have been done for communities of color and for disadvantaged students that I think we could also include, the need to support students from those backgrounds that also want to study in the STEM fields. Just a few thoughts.
I think that makes sense. And what I'd like to think through is at different levels of education. And Martha asked a question that is right up my alley because, again, we don't know each other that well, James, but my love, my passion is for the very, very forgotten early childhood STEM education. Martha, are you there with us? Can you ask your question?
I am. Thank you, Jeremy. Um, and I was really happy to hear that one of the 4 priorities of the Biden administration is equity. And I think equity starts with early learning and access to early learning. And so I guess my question is, I know many of the communities of practice have been doing work in this space, but what is going to be the approach or your thoughts on the approach from the new administration related to early STEM learning? And as this connects to Odellis's question around funding. So, we were really excited when the Carl Perkins money was, available to middle schools, but what are the strategies around getting that STEM funding all the way down to preschool?
Well, I think so. Great question and a great topic. I think, at the very end of the Obama administration, in the period around 2016, 17, the end of that period, the new education law, the Every Student Succeeds Act, was the first time you had a real big federal commitment to early childhood education. Right? There's a lot of new funding for that function authorized with the support of the Obama administration and with support from Capitol Hill. And I expect, so if there's will by the Biden administration to continue that as a priority, and I think there is, then there's an avenue for congressional support for that. It requires us to be really vocal in terms of making sure that early childhood education is a part of a STEM agenda in the same way, we talk a lot about K-12, we talk a lot about high school, but all the research shows the earlier you can provide an emphasis on the STEM subjects, the more effective that emphasis is in terms of translating to outcomes later in life. So I think it's part of us to make sure we talk about this in terms of our conversations with policymakers. But I think it's also important to realize that the administration has a pathway to do something that when, the last 2 administrations really didn't have that same kind of pathway, right? The Obama administration didn't have that in law. They had to propose it, and Congress eventually got to making it something they could support. Now that network, that pathway of support is in place, it's also in support, it's also in place in a lot of state governments to the extent that it wasn't prior as well. And I think this also goes to the larger issue of informal education in general, and the notion of supporting out of classroom supports as early childhood is in a lot of different settings, looking at settings that are non-traditional as a means for also gaining access to these subjects. You can call it many different things, but there's this notion that children need a wraparound of supports, not just from their schools.
I see a comment in here from Bonnie Mowers, who's talking about how funding is not the only issue and asking how can we ensure that STEM is incorporated in elementary schools where literacy and numeracy seem to be the only priorities. So it's not just, I think, that kind of that policy of guiding what the federal response is, but at the local level, how do we start to craft policy that supports the importance of STEM learning?
Well, I'm glad you raised this question of accountability, right? One of the clear data points we've had over the last year under the pandemic is that, the subjects that were not core to the ways in which schools are measured are really seeing a big fall off. So that's particularly true for subjects that are not math or reading, right, or English language arts. And so you could measure those declines in all the other subjects. Science is probably the biggest learning loss loser in most places, and we can quantify that both from teachers and from other outcomes, and over time too. So it's really only accelerated that trend. So part of this is those accountability decisions about how we measure learning. They're all going to need to be re-examined in the light of all the learning loss that's gone over the past year, and probably will continue into the future to some degree. You can't just go back to the same old systems of measuring by student test scores that we have for years, because there are some students who are a year behind, and they're going to stay a year behind until you catch them up, right? So traditional measures of outcome-based accountability systems aren't going to work in the first place. So to answer your question, I think, any sane strategy for getting schools back on the right footing is going to have to re-examine how we measure outcomes in general.
Mm.
And if we do that, and I think a lot of schools will, a lot of states will re-examine those assumptions, then there's an opportunity for us as the STEM community to really play a part in making sure that the subjects we care about, the ones we know are essential, factor into whatever accountability system emerges, right? I mean, we probably all collectively don't like testing to the extent that it takes away from other forms of instruction, but it's a lot like Winston Churchill's quote about democracy. It's the worst form of government except for all the others, right? We have to measure something. And what we measure is going to determine our priorities in the school system. So we have to accept that that's going to be something we deal with going forward. And I think we have to take that as an opportunity to make it a system that ensures kids are getting the skills we know they need.
When I was in a school district, James, this was several years back, but we were in the process of really changing what education looked like in that school. And that was kind of our goal from a directive by the superintendent. And maybe 6 months or so in, one of the school board members pulled me aside and said, when can we expect to see raises in the state assessments based on these changes? And she didn't love my answer, which was kind of what you were saying. It was, listen, if that's your goal, if that's the only thing that we're measuring, then what we're doing isn't right. And that's okay if that's what you decide as the board. But we're doing these other things. So you need to think about what are the non-state assessed items that are equally important to you that you want to see in the profile of a graduate from this district. And I think that conversation is really important, but hard.
Yeah, it is. And it's going to shift us. They're already on the way to measuring progress and not just achievement. And I think, the big takeaway from all this is we know we're way behind for a lot of students. We're going to have to measure their progress catching up, not just ding them for how they haven't caught up, right? I mean, that's the nature of where we're going, and that's just a reality we're going to have to confront, because the other part of this is you can't just throw out accountability systems and say, well, we're just going to pour money into schools and then everything will be fine. The participant who said, hey, it's not all about funding, absolutely right. I mean, I really think it's about priorities and making sure we take what we've got and spend it on the right things.
I've got a question here that I'd like to dig into a little bit, and then I'd like to talk, I think, a little bit more about sort of specific policy-based actions that we should all be thinking through. If you're with us right now and you haven't asked a question already, or if you have another one, make sure to get that into that Q&A tool. And if you don't have a question to ask, please make sure you're clicking that Q&A button anyway, reading the questions that are in there and voting up the ones that really resonate with you. Before we go to those specific policy questions, though, James, I'm hoping that Kathy Chen might be available to ask her question, and I forgot to unmute her, so I'm going to do that right now. Kathy, are you there with us?
Yes, I am.
Hi, Kathy. Could you ask your question?
Sure. I think James might have covered a little bit about this, but a lot of what we've been talking about is, how do we imagine something new? COVID uncovered all sorts of inequities. This might be the time to really push trying new models. But we also know a lot based on research and other attempts. I guess my question is about whether the new administration is willing to fund some of these or help allow others to actually try things out in some coordinated way, I guess.
Yeah, so James, we've got this issue that in education world, most of us have known for a very long time that there's massive disequity. For frankly, the first time, at least in my 20 whatever year career, there's this broad conversation outside of just the education spheres. People are noticing. My grandma, my aunts are talking about how it's not fair that not everybody has the same access to education. So we've got, I think, this groundswell moment. So now what? How do we make sure we don't lose that moment and actually address some of these disequitable issues?
Well, so this is a super important topic, and change in education is never easy, right? We've learned over the past decade or more that policies that originate in Washington are imposed on schools, whether they're well-intentioned or not, oftentimes are wrong and sometimes disastrously so. Um, we've seen backlash against things. We've seen things that failed. I think the right motif, and I think the Biden administration is open to this, is to take an example of learning what's worked in local communities and at the state level and amplifying it. Looking at that as the federal role is let's amplify the things that we've seen have been effective. Let's not force states to do something that's worked somewhere else, if they don't want to walk that pathway, but let's give them resources to amplify what they see has worked. That's that's something that we as a community can create that feedback loop if we speak with one voice and we're clear about what we want the administration to do in that front. But I also think we have to confront something that is a challenge, and it's worth saying out loud, and that is, there's always this back and forth between the term education reform and sort of the traditional status quo in education. And I think we have to get past the notion of it is this battle between, for lack of a better expression, labor unions on one side and education reform folks on the other. I think we don't want to fall back into that old conversation about trying to do something radically new, sometimes for the sake of doing something new. I think the way around that as a STEM community is to identify the things we know have worked in our community and see if we can amplify them at the higher level, whether that's, and I'll just throw out a few, whether that's supporting your project Lead the Way or your FIRST robotics or your computer science curriculum, whatever those elements are. I think there will be similarities, but there will also be some differences. And I think just, our theme as a community might be, and I'll just throw this out there as an idea, let's make sure there's some capacity at the federal government to provide additional assistance to states to support things that aren't supported now, but we know they're new and they're working. And secondarily, let's make sure there's flexibility, not just money, in federal rules to do things differently so that our leaders at the state and local level are not telling us, hey, I'd love to do that, but federal law doesn't let me do that, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just all about new money for new things. Sometimes it's about removing the impediments in federal policy or in state policy that are prohibiting us from doing those things.
We had some great town hall sessions a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that they kept talking about, these experts in the first 100 days and in federal policy, was exactly that. They kept saying, and so I think it's worth mentioning over and over again, that money, obviously, we all need it for our programs. It can be powerful and transformative, but it's a fairly small pool compared to what can be done from an influence perspective, what can be done from removing of barriers perspective. And I think that everybody listening today, as they're thinking about that local policy, don't ignore the money. It's important, but really try to focus on what those other components are. And it seems like, and I'm curious if you agree with this, there's a higher likelihood of things being done if we're talking about something beyond just funding.
That's right. No, and one of the topics, I mean, we as a coalition have had a number of conversations with the transition team, and they always want input on budgets and priorities and things that involve money, but they're also asking for, hey, give us what I'll call the negative examples, right? Give us the examples of things the federal government shouldn't be doing that they are doing, right? Or roadblocks that the federal government is putting up that they shouldn't be putting up to policies that you think are more effective, right? I mean, one of those relates to the accountability system, right? I mean, the federal government's considering, do we offer waivers to states on their federal accountability requirements, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a question where, we should put some thought into how, I would love input from ecosystems about what you think about that question, right? It's not a binary question of yes or no. We throw everything out or we keep everything the way it is. It's what are some of the elements of accountability that may inhibit, recovery to learning, right? What are some of the rules for who's eligible to participate in a teacher professional development program, right? I saw some chat comments to the effect of tracking and relating to CTE, right? One of the comments I get consistently from the community is, let's not treat CTE as a second-class citizen in education conversations, right? Well, there are a number of ways in which federal law inhibits that. There are a number of ways in which state and local practices inhibit that. Some CTE teachers, they might be teaching science content in a CTE course, but they are not eligible for the professional development for science teachers, right? Those are the kinds of things we need to shine some light on.
I always tell the story, James, that when I was a first an administrator in the second district I worked in, one of my biggest failures was that the superintendent wanted to remove some of the CTE programs to add more gym space for the state ranked basketball team. And I said nothing, and it happened. And one of the programs that got removed was the welding program. And from that day in this town, there's been a guy with a sandwich board on the main street holding a sign that says, for a couple different large organizations that are headquartered in the town, hiring TIG welders, $45 an hour to start plus full benefits. I have friends with doctorates who don't make $45 an hour.
Yeah.
These are good jobs, and it's a thing that we need to shift. Janelle Johnson mentioned in one of the questions, and I want to bring it up to you. She says we have to define what we mean by STEM. Are we just spelling out the acronym? Or are we talking about something more transformative? More specific than that, what I'm curious about, James, is what's the language around STEM that is going to get heard? As we're thinking about what that definition is, I think we all know some people who've said, oh, STEM. It's been around for 25 years and it's changed nothing. We know differently, but we also know there's been bad STEM out there that has sort of tarnished that name. So what do we need to be saying, and what kind of language do we need to be using in our policy work to make sure that it's heard?
Well, this may sound weird coming from a national organization with STEM in the name, but I feel like, we have to acknowledge the fact that science, technology, engineering, mathematics means something. STEM doesn't mean the same thing to a lot of different people, right? I mean, so you use the acronym, we need more STEM, right? That doesn't mean anything to most people in the education world. We ask the question, is my school a STEM school? I always answer that question with, well, every school is a STEM school, right? You're all teaching those subjects, right? I think the challenge for us as a community is to move past the notion of STEM being the driver for policy action, in the sense that telling people, hey, you really got to make STEM a priority isn't in itself the way to get to that outcome. The way, and that's evolved. Okay, so 15 years ago it was all about getting this on the radar screen. Nowadays it's about making clear the connections between increasing or improving your performance in those subjects, and we can define them lots of different ways, right? People say, does it include computer science or art or all the other things? Set that aside for a second and say, how can we link performance in those subjects with placing more students in the welding jobs you were talking about, right? Or how can we look at that in terms of companies moving to an area because they see the environment in that area as being providing the skills they need and the talent they need to locate those facilities, right? It's about drawing those connections between the importance of these subjects and excellence in these subjects and all the other outcomes in society that both politicians and voters and citizens and parents care about, right? Just saying STEM is important doesn't mean much unless they know, that's a beltway conversation that I think most people, they're not going to have the sandwich board on the street saying save STEM education. They're going to say save the welders, right? Like that's the connection that I think we have to make to translate this into what communities and what school boards and what people who make these decisions, they're looking at things like who's standing on the street with the sandwich board complaining, right? We have to make ourselves relevant to that conversation to get past this notion of STEM, having some meaning outside of our own community, because it's just an acronym to a lot of folks. And I'll just say, years ago, I sat down with a legislator in California, who I will not name, in the state house in California, and had a half-hour meeting. And after their first pause where they got a word in, they said, you know what, I don't support stem cell research, so I don't know why you're here. So we have to get past that.
It's a tough hurdle to get past. I see, James, I see Selena Roebuck, who's from near me, mentioning in the chat that every school should be a STEM school. And I always think about the fact I'm one of four, and I do this stuff and work in STEM in schools. But my siblings, my older sister is in marketing and advertising. My brother's a firefighter paramedic, and my little sister swims with sharks at the local aquarium. But all four of us use components of these STEM skills as part of our jobs, as part of being effective. It's those tools aren't just for those specific pipelines, which are critical, but it's not just for that. No matter what your career is, I think at least, the skill sets are important. Can you talk a little bit about that integration and about how we talk about the importance of STEM for people who say, my kids aren't going into STEM careers, so it's not important?
So it touches on a societal perception difference that I think is super important for us understanding how public policy and how policymakers look at this, right? So we're absolutely guilty of STEM education being seen through the eyes of the ivory tower, because that's where this term originated, right? 15 and 20 years ago, when this term first started being used, it was almost exclusively referring to the high school to college to graduate school to PhD pipeline. And that is a very small fraction of the people who achieve a degree or a credential or employment in a science, technology, engineering, or math field. In fact, most of the jobs are not even college, degree required, 4-year degree required jobs. Roughly half the jobs are the welders and the car mechanics and other people with STEM skills that most people don't identify with that term. The other part of this is there's a big rural and urban divide between these skills, right? There's this perception that STEM skills are only needed in big cities and urban areas. But, so for example, I was looking at some data. One of our partners showed us that the career field in Iowa with the highest awareness was construction. The field in Iowa with the lowest career awareness was agribusiness. And that's the agrobioscience, meaning intelligent crop manufacturing, right? So people don't know about careers that are really important that we would call STEM careers, but the general public doesn't identify with STEM at all. They may think of it in some totally different frame of reference. So I think the first step for us as a community is to recognize all those pathways and get past our sort of traditional barriers of, hey, we don't care about the welders, right? They're not on the STEM career track. If it requires problem solving and using data, like at a minimum, it's a STEM career in my estimation of how we look at careers. We have to absolutely drop those stereotypes ourselves and think about all the different pathways into this, this vast career path, and not fall into the stereotype of thinking this is just about, quote, smart kids going to graduate school. Have to get way past that.
Sue Kezios, I see you talking with James in chat, and you also put a question here in the Q&A tool that I'm hoping you could ask while we're on this topic of this rural-urban divide. Sue, you're there?
Am I unmuted?
Nope. Yeah, you're there. We hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I have a grant and we're working with rural communities. And it's so funny. Somebody earlier noted the difference between like the AIG kids are tracked here and the CT kids are tracked here. And I really see that in the rural communities, that welding and these kinds of jobs are not seen as STEM jobs. They're not seen as what their elite students would be tracked into. And so we've been working so hard to get these kids to understand the STEM they use every day on the farms, with the work that they're doing. And, it seems to be working. Some of the kids have signed up this year to try to go to North Carolina has a residential high school for kids in STEM. And some of our farm kids signed up this year because they now believe that they are STEMist themselves, that, just trying to break down this difference between what's a STEM job and what's not a STEM job.
Well, I just think it's partly on us to understand these differences and embrace them. And so, for example, this transition of recognizing what I'd call the technician, when I was growing up, we called these blue collar jobs. I think the right term now are technicians, like people who work with technology, who work with their hands, who apply it in an advanced way in some manner, that clearly puts them in the definition of a STEM job. I think just having that awareness in our own community, and embracing it is the right starting point. And that's happened largely in the last several years, but there's still more room to be done there. And then, that involves also getting back to our teacher workforce and making sure that, not just we in the sort of the stakeholder community care about this, but that teachers are getting the training and the knowledge that they need to help understand those changing patterns and be able to embrace them in terms of how they're teaching and how they're talking about careers and how they're exemplifying them. If you never talk about welding, nobody knows what it is, right? That's one of those. It's a good example of what we talk about scientists and physicists and mathematicians, in these conversations we have about career futures real frequently. But I don't think we talk as much about the auto mechanics and the TIG welders and the people who work in aircraft manufacturing and all these other jobs that to your point, Jeremy, if a student had full knowledge of the economics, I bet very few of them would. I mean, I'm going to say this and then retract it, right? But I bet very few of them would go to college. They'd all go study in these super high earning fields that there are not enough workers, right? I mean, if that was their only criterion, right? Nothing else like that. If students had perfect knowledge for those fields and no biases, I feel like we would have solved those gaps, because there are just these really big economic differences where, some fields are paying much higher salaries for specific skills than they are paying for certain educational credentials.
Thank you. James, we've got at least one question, maybe some more that are really specific about policy and the creation of policy and policy memos. And since we've got you here, I want to make sure that we get to some of those. So I'm going to go to that first one, but if any of the rest of you are working on policy memos for that town hall work that we did a couple weeks ago, or for other initiatives in your ecosystems, go ahead and hurry up and try to get those questions in the Q&A right now. But to start us off, Nancy Peter, I think I just unmuted you, and Nancy has a really good question about kind of a specific issue with the suggested requirements for some policy she's working on and the reality of the world that she's working in. Nancy, are you there with us?
I am with you all. So I assume that you can hear me.
Yes.
And my question, James, and you have presented to our statewide ecosystem. We so appreciate your insight into all of this. And we were working on our policy memo over the weekend and realized that we needed to spend a lot more time sort of digging more deeply. But one of the challenges we had was that our first priority was to do due diligence, research the situation, the communities, the existing resources, build on existing efforts. But in the instructions, and this is a very specific question, the instructions asked us to define a specific action item, including who the partners would be and what the cost would be. And so we found ourselves in a little bit of a contradiction, which is on one hand, we're saying, do due diligence, figure out exactly what the issues are and the existing strategies. And on the other hand, in the same memo, what are the action items? How much do they cost? Who will do them? So I was hoping you could give me a little bit of insight into sort of how to reconcile those two.
So let me put you in the position of somebody who's on the Biden transition team. So if we look at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, there are about 75 people
I have
working in
no
that function
idea.
when it's fully staffed in the White House. Am I still lost?
No, I think you're back now.
Okay, all right. So so
I thought it was me.
Science and technology backgrounds of lots of different kinds, but there's in the last two administrations, there were maybe 5 or 6 people working on STEM education across the entire federal government, right? So they have to be generalists by the nature of their jobs. There are lots of people working on programs at agencies, but those are the people making policy for the quote administration are not a lot of people. So the first job is for us as outside stakeholders is to help them do their job by doing the homework for them, by doing the research for them, to provide recommendations that have a basis in reality that they find credible. And the credible is the who, right? Who's it coming from and who are they representing in their calls, right? And that's why it's important for us to have breadth when we make those. So it's really powerful if to your example, Nancy, to get all the Pennsylvania groups on the same page, right? So it's coming from the whole state ecosystem network, if it can, right? The second point is I appreciate doing the research. You can definitely, always sharpen the pencil on that score, but you can't wait forever, right? So you got to do what's reasonable to do. And I think, you're not speaking to a scientific standard here of can I prove it to get it published? You're trying to be credible. And that's, you just want to be able to make a clear argument for here's the problem we see, and here's how this action at the federal government will help solve this problem. And secondly, there are things the federal government can do and they can't do. They can provide funding for programs, or they can change federal laws. That's about it, actually. When you think about what the federal government does, they can't change culture. They can't make state people do decisions differently than they're doing. They can offer funding, and they can change federal laws. And so that's the kind of the context you want to put your recommendations in, if you can. And if you can't, and all you can identify is a problem and a potential avenue of, hey, if we could do this thing differently, that's a step in the right direction. But really what these folks are trying to get at is, what can I change in federal law, or what can I change in terms of funding priorities that I will propose to Congress? That's what they would tell you, right? They'd all tell you, I'm not God because I work at the White House. I'm just trying to, to feed the decision making that happens within the federal government. So that's the way I would look at the level of detail, is trying to help them answer those two questions. What would you change in federal law, meaning the rules, right? I can't do this because of this, or I have to do it because of this, or what are the priorities for federal funding?
I think another thing to think about, and I'm curious if you agree, is that it's important to be thinking about what the priorities of the people in the positions are. Andres, are you there with us to ask your question?
Yeah, hi. Can you see me all right? Or can
Yeah,
you
we
hear
hear
me
you.
okay?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
hello. Hi, everybody. Andres Enriquez from the New York Hall of Science. They've appointed some really interesting people at the Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, like Alondra Nelson, who's really focused on issues of equity. I'm trying to figure out the connection between OSTP and the folks that they are appointing and the policies that are going to come out of the White House. Obviously, how does that going to work, and how closely are they going to be in terms of influencing the NSFs and the Department of Education in terms of how those dollars flow?
So great question. So here's the ecosystem that the folks at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy live in. So you got the president, and then all the functions that advise the president. So OSTP is one of them. They provide guidance to federal agencies on their policies as they relate to science and technology, right? So OSTP can tell the National Science Foundation, for example, hey, you're not awarding enough grants to people of color. Change your policies so that you can address that issue. That's kind of the level of guidance, the decision. They can't tell them spend more money on this grant program or not, but they can tell them the issues they identify and ask them to provide responses and change their policies to address challenges, right? So our advice to this particular bunch, the OSTP folks, is to identify the problems and sort of chart out the solutions. The other two parts of the ecosystem that are worth mentioning, so there's the Office of Management and Budget. Those are the folks that actually look at the federal budget like Wall Street investment bankers look at their investments. They say, how much did we spend on this program? What do we get for it? Right? That's what that office does. And they're the ones who actually provide budgets and budget authority to federal agencies. And then the third part of this is the education piece. So that's run out of a group called the Domestic Policy Council, which typically the leader of, so the reason why it matters that the science advisor is now at a cabinet level is that, when a president makes decisions, a lot of times the science advisor wasn't in the room. Well, the domestic policy advisor is always in the room when they make decisions about things that involve education, healthcare, things of that kind. That's typically and traditionally a really strong role in that. That person in the Biden White House is Susan Rice now. So a very senior, I mean, she was a candidate for vice president at some point. So she's, a very senior person in government. And so having Eric Lander from OSTP at the table with those three voices in government is gives them a powerful voice. But that's kind of they combine to make education related policies. And then the White House can't it can't dictate. It gives directives to the departments and agencies to do different things, to do things differently. And then it has to, pursue those. It doesn't just send a memo over and expect that that's what the agency actually does. They have to hold their feet to the fire. And that's what the folks that we've talked about in those three offices of the White House do, is they hold the agencies to account to make sure they're doing what the White House told them to do. That's kind of how that ecosystem works.
Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Wallanda McLeod has kind of more of a statement in the Q&A, but I think it leads to an interesting question. Walanda, are you there with us? There you are.
I am.
Hi there. Could you ask your question?
I just wanted to kind of make sure that we don't forget about the community-based learning opportunities for community centers and other places that are doing out of school STEM education as well. So I know we've been talking about school and early ed and high school and middle school and all of that, but there's always a space for those of us that do community-based learning as well after school.
So what have you seen success in, James, when we're working on policy, when we're advocating for changes in that sort of combination of in-school time, out-of-school time? How can we harness that most successfully?
Well, the last decade or so, there's been a great convergence of people in the STEM community and people in the informal learning world, right? So if you talk to a mayor in like 1990 and asked them, what do you think about informal education? They think, well, this is getting kids off the streets. I see it as a crime prevention. That's what after school was, a generation or two ago. Now policymakers look at this as, this is how we enhance the job prospects of our kids. It's where we give them exposure to new things. We can do things in informal learning settings that we can't do in the school because the rules are different, way more flexible. That's where the biggest growing programs are in STEM education, right? That's where FIRST Robotics lives. That's where Project Lead the Way's programs live. They live at that boundary between formal education and informal education. So I think there's this recognition that those pathways are incredibly important. And you're right, it should never be an afterthought. I think the message the administration has gotten from us is you need to have a strategy that, just like in many ways is kind of similar to the comment earlier of don't put CTE on the sidelines. I think you have to look at informal the same way, is that they deserve just as big a seat at the table as anyone else in the STEM conversation, because they're making a contribution that number one, we all know is important, but number two, it's pretty difficult to measure, right? You don't measure it with test scores. You don't measure it with traditional data. You measure it with longer term outcomes, right? The kids who participate in high quality informal learning do much better down the line, right? But we measure them in terms of their lives and their livelihoods, not their test scores, right? So you have to recognize that there are different ways for sort of measuring their success as well. And that's been a big focus of public policy, is making sure that there are the resources at the National Science Foundation, at the Institute for Education Sciences, in state education departments to really grapple with this. And further, a big part of our message at the state level has been, to a state policymaker is, hey, you can look at the informal space as a means for helping recover some of the learning loss that's happened over the COVID period of the last year, because you're not going to invent more school time, right? But you might do that science lesson that you were going to do in class. You might do the experiment in the after school program, right? You might go do the field trip in the after school program. You might do some of those things that you couldn't do in class for the last couple of years, but you maybe make up that time in the informal setting. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and I wouldn't want anybody to feel like that in any way. I mean, you can definitely look at that as an enhancement of whatever your agenda is in STEM, is to make sure informal is at the table.
Thank you, James. We're about out of time. When we had that call a couple of weeks ago with the Day One Project folks, I think my biggest takeaway as we're thinking about policy was, number one, to not only focus on dollars, but number two, to really focus on found solutions that could be expanded rather than just outlining a problem. I'm wondering if you have any other closing thoughts for us on things that we should be thinking about as we craft policy, as we forge partnerships, and as we try to work together to make a positive change in this country.
Well, the parting thought I would have here is, we've talked about the 100 days, we've talked about day one. I think what I hope people take from this is a renewed interest in policy that maybe hasn't been there, in recent years. That there is an opportunity here for us to make some real progress, and don't just look at this as a one-time thing. I think the feedback loop that we've gradually evolved as a community is that the STEM education world has a greater impact on policy now than in the past, because of groups like the ecosystems, and those of you individually have become more interested in this topic. I think that is incredibly important for you to take away, is, don't just do this yourself. encourage another group to come in and become an apprentice in your efforts if they've never done it before, or think about doing this on their own going forward. Because if our community, the STEM education world, punched at its weight in public policy, considering all the stakeholders and all the companies and all the the people we have that care about this issue, they're just not engaged in the policymaking process at nearly the same level of participation as lots of other parts of American life. So that's our opportunity going forward, is let's really come together and make sure our voices are heard by making sure everybody can have a chance to do this.
Well, thank you, James, and thank you for all the partnership you've had with the ecosystems in the past, and for spending an hour with us today. I know that I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate it. Thank you also, everyone who's submitted their one-page summaries of their ecosystems. We'll put the link in the chat if you haven't seen it yet, or if you hadn't had a chance to do it, so that you can try to hurry up and make sure that that gets done. We're very eager to have this as part of the final report that we're compiling based on the 2 town hall sessions we had earlier this month. Speaking of that report, we're in the final stages of production of the report and hope to have a draft ready for you by the end of the week. Please watch your email for that. So thank you again, James. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you all again really soon.